So, Lisa, let's start with that plane ticket to Tokyo. You had spent time there as a teen, which I'm actually curious about. Now you're selected to run the Japanese equities business globally for Goldman out of Tokyo. One of your first leadership experiences. What was this like?
Well, this was a big deal for me. In some ways, it was a dream. It was a big role, especially as a foreigner and a woman. But in many ways, this was where all the paths that I had been on since a fork in the road decision as a 15-year-old to study Japanese, after my first trip there, kind of all led to. So it was a big moment. In some ways, everything that I had done up until then was getting me ready for this role.
Mm.
Um,
Okay, so
so,
pause. What are some of the things you've done up until then? Tell us more.
well, up until then, I had actually had a pretty crazy set of experiences that I don't think you could have lined up if you had tried. My first experience in Japan was uh, winning a scholarship for an opportunity to do a homestay with a Japanese family for 3 months between my junior and senior years of high school. That family spoke no English. I spoke no Japanese. I am still to this day shocked that my parents allowed me to go to the other side of the planet at a time when, not to date myself, there was no internet. Phone calls were incredibly expensive. And, they really couldn't stay in touch with me or keep tabs on me in any way. And I'm allergic to fish. There were so many reasons I should not have been there. Yet, as a 15-year-old, I had a real mind expanding experience in first getting exposure to the world, and second, learning empathy. I think in a way that I think about a lot. And it's the kind of experiences when you go to a culture that can feel as foreign as Japan. You show up and say, well, why do I have to take off my shoes when I am in the porch and can't wear them in the house like I do at home? And then, by the end of the summer, I kind of figured out, like, wait, the real question is, why don't we? And so, I learned a lot of that really early, and that has stayed with me. I ended up going to Harvard undergrad, intending to be an English major, starting to take Japanese in what was a very small department in the 80s, and ended up, in order to take Japanese, realizing that I had to major in East Asian studies. My parents kind of freaked out. What was I going to do with that degree? And, sometimes luck is wonderful. By the time I graduated, which was in 1988, Japan was the fastest growing, nation in the world. Their economy was being studied by everyone. And I happened to have the language and culture skills that very few people did. So I end up going to Tokyo as, I guess, what you'd call an intern for Japan's largest media company that no one had heard of, a company called the Fuji Sankei Group. And when I got over there, I was able to visit a number of companies and choose which company I wanted to work with. And I chose the one that looked the most energized and a little crazy. And that ended up being production unit number 2 at Fuji TV, Japan's largest, private TV network. And they were known for making Japanese game shows and a home shopping show. And so that was an introduction to edutainment. And it was a fascinating place to learn and learn all kinds of slang, by the way, that I hadn't learned when I studied Japanese properly in undergrad. And home shopping was not even a thing then. So that was a fascinating way to help introduce some products to the Japanese audience right when the country was kind of opening up, from an economic power standpoint. It was really becoming more of a globally interested country. And so I worked for 2 years at Fuji TV. I went to New York and then worked in their overseas office, which was in New York, and did all kinds of crazy business development assignments. And then realized that, one, they were never going to let me run the place. And two, all of my friends who had graduated from college at the same time and had gone on to, analyst roles at investment banks or consulting roles, et cetera, were starting to speak a language that I couldn't understand. It was a language of business. And I realized at that point that I needed to go back to business school, something that I had never thought of. And so I went to Harvard for business school. And by that time, the Japanese economy had imploded. Nobody cared about my Japan experience. And I was in class with, people who were consultants and bankers and accountants, and I'm taking accounting for the first time. But I ended up eventually finding my way to this role called Japanese equity sales, which would pay me to talk to smart people about Japan all day. And I started that initially at Barclays when they had a brokerage unit called BZW in New York, and loved it so much that when an opportunity came to move over to Goldman Sachs, I seized that opportunity and then ended up spending the next 20 years at Goldman doing a variety of different things. So kind of an unusual background. And as someone who I know loves disruption, Whitney, I'll just say one of the weirdest things. And that is when I got to a trading floor, which is, not an environment that is normal. It is 24/7. It is crazy. It is loud. It is organized chaos. I felt so at home because that was exactly what the production unit of Fuji TV was like. A big open floor with information, with buzz, with so much going on. And I noticed that and just felt very grateful, because otherwise I don't know if I would have survived.
Wow. It's fascinating. I guess two thoughts are coming to mind. One is interesting how familiarity. I remember the first time I went to India. I had worked in Latin America and lived in Latin America for, decades. And the first time I went to India, it felt so comfortable and familiar, in part because of it was frenetic and alive and people were up at 2 a.m. And so when you said that, I had a similar thought of like, you got onto the trading floor at Barclays and you're like, oh yeah, I know this. I love this. I feel alive and everybody's alive doing something.
Totally. Yes.
Okay. So I also find it fascinating is here you are 15 years old. You must have skipped a grade because you're talking about junior to senior year in high school. Most people are 16.
I turned 16.
Okay.
I turned 16 during the summer.
Okay. Isn't it interesting how one event can change the course of your life? I find that
Absolutely
fascinating.
I marvel at that. Yeah. Random. Why did that happen? I don't know, but it did.
Yeah. So good. All right. So what was it like in your first leadership position over at Goldman in Tokyo?
So I had run the Japan desk in New York, which frankly was a small product covering all the institutions in North America that were focused on Japan. But you can imagine a football field sized trading floor, and like the Japan desk was one desk. So I think you're right in saying this was like my first big step up. And, I already had a lot of relationships. I had been in Japanese product. I knew a lot of my colleagues in Tokyo, and I traveled back and forth to Tokyo. But, it was a very meaningful challenge to go from, being a peer to then being the leader. And you have to do that really thoughtfully and sensitively, especially in a place like Japan. And I knew that as a foreigner who spoke Japanese and knew the culture, that I was considered a strange foreigner. There's a term for it, hen nagaijin, strange foreigner. And I knew that that's what I was. I kind of, reveled in it, but that didn't always make me the kind of predictable leader that people tended to prefer. And I could sometimes act very Japanese, and I could sometimes act foreign. And, I knew that there was a lot of opportunity for perhaps some confusion and discomfort, my own and others. So, I think drawing upon things that I learned from that very first experience in Japan, like listen, observe, respect, and bring empathy. And in doing so, hopefully very authentically, you can build trust. But again, I was already a known quantity. It wasn't like I
Right.
was dropped in out of nowhere. I had worked with people before, and that helped tremendously. So,
Yeah.
I told my team, let's play into my biggest competitive advantage, the curious fact that I was a foreigner and a woman who could speak Japanese. And we knew that that would definitely open the door for a first meeting. And
Yeah.
I would call this like the talking dog effect. And I set as the KPI for us all, however, to get the second meeting,
Mm.
because the first meeting was a curious meeting. The second meeting was, oh, well, maybe she has something to say. And
Mhm.
thankfully, with the help of my team, who had great relationships, and my not screwing things up too badly, we were able to do that. So, I'll pause there. I could go on.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. So KPI, for people who don't know, it's key performance indicator, and I think it is interesting how well, a couple of thoughts. Number one is launch point of a new S curve. You are curious, you observe, you have these relationships, which allows it to be a little bit smoother of an on ramp. But you didn't go in, and I think I was going to ask for advice. And I think the advice, let me see if I can pull it through, is for when you go into a new situation, no matter how good of ideas you have, no matter how competent you may be, you need to start by building a relationship, observing what's happening, and appreciate, honor, respect what has already happened before you start to try to effect change. Would you add anything to that?
I think that was beautifully said. And
Okay.
I've used that strategy over and over.
Mhm.
And I found, at least for me, it works and ensures that maybe I get up that curve faster, because people will start to share
Mhm.
information with me if I can create trusted, safe spaces. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting, I loved what you said about the KPI, is that you want to set your indicators, or your metrics that you're measuring yourself by, are the ones that require you to stretch just a little bit. Like you said, getting the first meeting, that's not a problem. Everybody can make that call. But what's the behavior change? What's the action that you need to implement a little bit differently than what you're already doing in order to get the second meeting? And that's interesting as well, is make sure you've got the indicators that are going to push you in the direction you want to go. Okay. All right. So let's fast forward. You've been successful in this role. You have opportunities to continue to advance. You've now become a partner at Goldman, which is a huge deal. It's now 2010, around that time period where there's a lot of crisis financially. You ask the president of Goldman for a new challenge. So I have two questions for you around that. Number one is, from a psychological standpoint, how did you know it was time for a new challenge? And number two, what was the challenge? And a third question, what did you do?
Okay. So I think most people, at least at investment banks, have vertical careers. I guess you start in an area, you hope to become expert in it, and then you hope to run it. And I was thrown this amazing curveball at the end of 2005, just to give you a little context,
Mhm.
that put me in a whole new area, having grown up in the securities division for 11 years as the chief operating officer of all things, global compliance.
Oh,
And I was dropped into a completely new area. I mean, obviously, I'd worked with compliance before, but this was compliance for the entire firm, and a real step away from anything Japan, or from anything, that had been my life in securities with internal clients, etc. And that was my first real lesson in, I guess, the power of being agile, because of that experience, which extended to legal and audit as well. In the years leading up to that financial crisis, I kind of got the feeling and the confidence that you could drop me in, and I will figure things out and work really hard to bring a perspective that adds value. So,
oh, wait.
so by the,
Pause. I got a question. Okay, we're going to come back to 2010, but I want to go back to 2005. That's super
yeah,
interesting. Here's the question. What do you think you did or what character traits did you exhibit? Because we know that men tend to get judged on potential from a research perspective, and women on track record. You were focused on sales, equities. They put you in this operational role, big COO role. What did you exhibit, or did your manager do? What were the conditions that created that situation where they were willing to drop you into that role?
So that's a great question. And I've thought about this a lot. One answer is maybe they just wanted to get me out of this, get rid of me. But another answer is to think about the context of the markets and the business at that time.
Okay.
So this was a time when the entire margin structure of the securities business was changing. And rather than see growth in those, shares business, equities businesses at that time, because of the regulatory environment that was heating up, the growth at the firm was actually in the control functions. And, I was asked to go work with the global head of compliance, who had been brought in by the CEO of the firm, was a distinguished, brilliant lawyer who understood so many aspects of compliance, but maybe had run a team of 12 in the work that he'd done. Yet here he was running this global team of, I think at the time, probably 400 people in an enterprise. So a very different experience for him. And somebody decided, he needs a chief operating officer who understands the business, who's a partner, who's been at the firm and understands the culture, and can bring a revenue mindset, having grown up, covering external clients and running a, quote, revenue business, to a business that was really about subject matter expertise. And interestingly, one of my bosses from the securities division had moved into that role before me. So it was already kind of a path. He was then tapped to run another business because somebody departed, and he needed a successor, and that became me. And the big decision for me was, do I step away from something that I get better at by the day, because, every day you learn markets, you're better at it. And all these relationships that I had in my Japan background and all of these things that I thought made me perfect for the place I was in. Do I step away from that and suddenly surround myself with all these subject matter experts who are brilliant? I could never be a compliance person. How am I going to do this? And everyone was advising me against it. And I thought, wait a second, this is the kind of role where if I go into a compliance role, I will learn about every business of the firm. And I thought that was a real opportunity for growth. And I was just curious. And so I decided to do it. And I ended up having to, figure out, how am I going to be credible with all of these brilliant compliance officers? How on earth am I going to justify my existence, which I think is a very good Goldman way of thinking about things? How am I going to add value, having come from a very different experience? And it was so easy to find ways to add value. I can give you one example if you'd like.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, this is, and before you do it, I think what you're about to say is you found a way to take your strengths and make them distinctive. And so let's see if I'm right. And if not, we can cut that part out. So what did you do? What's your example?
I think I was trying to find what strengths were even relevant here. And I realized that one of the most important skills that I had to have to be a salesperson in a relationship business with external clients was to really develop a client service strategy, mentality, and approach. How am I going to build relationships? How am I going to differentiate myself? How am I going to add value so that I can attain the high level of being the go-to trusted advisor that my clients relied on. A very competitive market. That's a hard thing to do. Yet when I got to compliance, I realized that no one was teaching that there. Yet there were internal clients everywhere. And I saw an opportunity to bring that client service skill set to compliance situations and realized that as I talked to people and as I talked to, folks who were in the business compliance's clients, a language compliance didn't even use, that all of those relationships were usually defined by very stressful situations.
Yeah.
Something's going wrong, call the compliance person, hope they don't say no, wait until the last minute to call them because they're gonna say no. And like, that's not a relationship building experience. So nobody was really thinking about, hey, outside of these stressful situations, I should start meeting with my client and talking with them about what are their business goals? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to build? And then I become an enabler, not a no-sayer, because I kind of understand what they're doing and I could use my subject matter expertise to help them navigate how to do it, not be called in at the last minute because I don't have the relationship except in the stressful situation and tell them they can't do it because I haven't been given enough time to figure that out. And so that just created a whole conversation and really training and a philosophy that just hadn't been in that division before. And, it was so interesting to me to be able to pull on something that was almost like breathing to an area that just hadn't had reason to think that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So you took your strength that was fairly common on a sales desk or a trading desk and put it into this new environment where it was just an outlier, superpower, towering strength, and you were able to make things happen. Okay. That's fascinating. All right. So let's go back now. It's so fun to analyze, like kind of dissect what you were doing and what happened. So 2010 comes, and you're ready for another new challenge. What happened? Tell us more.
So I realized that I was getting comfortable. I was sort of getting a little bored. I didn't feel my learning curves were as steep. I felt like there were other people who could step in and do what I had started to do. And I think it was a real moment when I realized how much I like steep curves. And that's when I knew I needed to raise my hand for a new thing. And I had no idea what that was. And honestly, having done this with compliance, then legal, then audit, I didn't care what it was as long as it was meaningful to get done and an opportunity to learn where, I was given responsibility to figure it out. So I never expected that the opportunity that I would be asked to take on was global head of brand marketing and digital strategy in the executive office. I mean, this was a time when Goldman didn't even use the word brand. It was before Goldman was the focus of what would subsequently become a terrible crisis and brand challenge. And ironically, as we're sitting here with news like in this week that social channels are now need a warning label, and digital strategy was added to my title just to make sure I paid attention to it. No one really knew what that was or how that was going to be relevant. And so I ended up immediately, a week and a half after I took this role, before I even really had a chance to figure out what it was, in crisis mode because the SEC filed fraud charges against Goldman. And all of a sudden, like, that brand was out of our control. And it certainly wasn't the brand that we wanted. Goldman immediately became the poster child for all that was evil on Wall Street. And it was a firm that had, I guess if it did have a brand, that brand was mystique. Goldman never talked about its brand. Goldman had very important and powerful relationships with institutional investors, not with individuals, not with consumers, not with Main Street. So like they hadn't advertised. They didn't need to do any of the things that other banks that had those businesses did. And so I found myself not only on the edge of the financial crisis, but also at this really interesting moment when everything that had defined marketing and advertising and analytics was getting disrupted because these social channels were emerging, and the whole set of possibilities around reputational risk were what we were living in front of everyone. So on the one hand, I have my colleagues who, are trying to navigate being hated as a brand, something Goldman had not really experienced before. And all of these founders who were doing the coolest things at these startups that were, redefining defining what digital and social channels were. And so, whatever I thought were the steep learning curves suddenly like multiplied. And frankly, if I had been an experienced CMO at that point, like I would have still had to learn completely new things. So it ended up being perfect. And, that became my adventure. And I really felt like, the universe was somehow putting me in that place, because in a regulated industry, in order to do anything that clearly had to be done in an innovative way, both because Goldman never had done it, and there were new ways of doing it with digital and social, I came with all of these relationships and trust from the control side of the house, who were the ones that were going to have to approve everything anyway. And so I don't know that anyone put those pieces together. Certainly no one expected us to be in crisis when I took that role. But given that I was there, I used every strength that I had, and it made us move faster.
So you had this massive resource that you could tap into because of the last 5 years that you had invested in building that social and reputational capital. I'm sensing a theme. There's this thread of relationship. So what are one or two things that you did from a PR perspective? So, brand new S-curve for sure. I think that's interesting when you think about the idea of disruption, where you were not a traditional CMO. So you didn't have this playbook in your brain, which it sounds like in many ways was a huge boon to you, because you're just like, we just have to solve this. And you didn't have any idea of how you should be doing it. You're just going to solve it. Curious, one or two things that you did that one might argue were somewhat innovative in your approach to managing through this PR disaster.
Yeah. I had a small, fantastic team. And we realized that no one really understood what Goldman Sachs did. And it's easy to attack a mystery, especially a powerful entity, especially an entity that could very easily be associated with greed at a time when lots of people economically especially Main Street was starting to suffer in the crisis. Like we were the perfect target. And we realized that we needed to somehow create a better understanding of Goldman Sachs and the way in which the firm actually contributes to the economy, and humanize the firm, because nobody had any touch points other than randomly potentially knowing someone somehow, but not because of doing business for the most part. So we spent a lot of time listening in the firm, outside of the firm, focus grouping, researching, and really trying to figure out how could we authentically tell our story. Because the lesson that was playing out around us was, if you don't tell your own story, others will tell it for you. Mm-hmm. And now they had all these channels and ways to get their voice out that had never existed before. And so we knew we had to tell our story. And we knew that Main Street was the unlikely focus. And I think that had been a big blind spot. Sometimes you think that if your direct customer is not affected as much, that you don't have to really focus on others. Like, you might not see who the other stakeholders are. And I think that was a big blind spot. But frankly, Mystique had worked really, really well. And so, we're also dealing with like a service business. It's not like tangible products. How do you explain what an investment banking transaction is? And so we worked with some really brilliant partners. At the time, it was Y&R and VML. We decided that we could create a digital campaign. And in order to be really authentic, we saw that the only real option for us was to tell these mini documentary stories. And it would be like 4 boxes. The first box, the first part of the story would be our client and who were they, then what problem they had, then how they solved it. And then Goldman people would show up and say, this is how we worked with that client and we're part of this story. And as such, show up as like real human beings who cared about the impact of that story. And inevitably that story would have an impact on the economy, on a city, on job creation. And it was all believable, authentic, and actually they were pretty beautiful stories. But as you can imagine, getting a client to put their name next to Goldman Sachs when we were in the crosshairs was a big ask. And, the first one that we did was about the creation of a stadium in Louisville. And like, who doesn't like a stadium, but who thinks about what it takes financially to create a stadium? And that stadium had such a huge impact on the development and economy of Louisville. I mean, forget about whether Goldman was in the story. It was a great story. And so this campaign was called Progress is Everyone's Business. And we were able to tell these stories of progress that way. I remember when this thing launched, the firm had never done advertising before it. It was super scary. And to do so in digital channels in this construct was very innovative. People were first starting to see ads appear on websites and things like that. So it was a level of visibility that was super uncomfortable for Goldman Sachs. And I remember very vividly the day that all of the switch was flipped and this was going live. Like, I was curled up in a ball in the fetal position in my office because, it's such an interesting thing that happens even in a wonderful culture like Goldman was. If you're driving change, it can be super lonely. And all of a sudden, like, everyone's supportive. And then it's like, okay, Lise, let's see what happens when we flip the switch. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my responsibility. And that was a lesson. That was a lesson too. But like, it went well. It ended up becoming an award-winning campaign. And I think that it was a great way that the firm started to communicate differently.
Yeah, so good. All right. So you, what year did you decide to leave Goldman?
So I decided to leave Goldman actually in the middle of 2014. So 10 years ago now. March. Yeah, it's that seems like a long time ago. Yeah. But it feels like yesterday. I went and resigned in March of 2014. I was asked to stay on as an advisory director. So I did that from June through January of 2015. So in reality, I cut the cord in the end of January 2015.
Yeah. How did you know it was time?
This is going to be an answer you might not expect. I knew it was time because my dad had suddenly passed away. And so my dad, had just retired from being a beloved OBGYN in New York. And one day in the middle of October, I was leading a meeting with my brand team and got a phone call that was a game changer. My dad had apparently fallen off a ladder and had lost consciousness. And I had to run home at that moment. It was a Friday afternoon, and he never regained consciousness. And it was so sudden. And, one of the things that happens in those moments is that, your life kind of flashes before you. And for me, I had a career of running all the time. Like, I used to get criticized on the trading floor for running. And I slammed into a brick wall and suddenly just had time to slow down and reflect. Like, hold on, like, where am I? What do I want in my life? What are my priorities? And one of the things that, my dad passing away really made me think about was the fact that, he was always off delivering babies and doing these amazing things, but not at dinner. And I was kind of repeating that history. I was never home in time for dinner. I was working. I loved my work. He loved his work. And, my older son was a sophomore in high school. My younger son was like in 8th grade. And I suddenly saw this clock starting to tick backwards from when they would disappear off to college. And it dawned on me that my purpose at that point was to be home in time for dinner. And that's what I knew I needed to do. And for the first time, I paused enough to say, well, can I do that? And I realized that I fortunately had, the financial wherewithal to step away. And I know not everybody can do that, but I realized I was able to do that. And that was what I did. And everybody thought I was crazy. I was 48 years old at the time. And maybe it was crazy, but I have no regrets about that decision.
So it wasn't crazy.
So that is why I left Goldman. I might still be there otherwise.
Yeah, it's interesting. So your dad passing away disrupted your life. It disrupted your thought patterns. It disrupted, and it gave you an opportunity to really step back, evaluate, and make some decisions.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right. So let's talk about what you're currently doing. And actually, before we go there, I want to just one quick question. Yeah. So when you made that transition, you jumped off one S curve into I'm going to be home for dinner. What was one of the challenges of that?
So as much as I tried to prepare for this, because I had some time to be an advisory director and kind of ease into leaving, I did not expect feeling profoundly uncomfortable with, one, the fear of losing my edge, the fear of going stale. And when you leave an environment like a Goldman or a trading floor where you're used to information coming at you at all times, you step on the other side of that and it goes really quiet. And it dawned on me that I didn't have the same access to information that I used to. And what was I going to do about that? I didn't want to go stale. And I didn't want to become irrelevant. I wasn't ready to become irrelevant yet. And those two things propelled me to, go back into the city every day. My kids were obviously at school. I could still be home in time for dinner and start to spend time with the founders and that network that I had cultivated from my brand role, because they already had proven themselves as full of possibility, full of ideas. They were going to be my new way of staying sharp. And of course, I would find ways to be helpful to them and test and challenge myself in the process. And so those were really profound fears. I was going through an identity crisis.
Yeah.
Before that, someone would ask me, "What do you do, Lisa?" And it would be very easy. I'm a partner at Goldman Sachs. I'm a this title at this place. And once I went to the other side of that, like, what am I? And how do I answer that? And who do I want to be? And I had to really start to think about those things. So that with a little bit of FOMO mixed in.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting thing where one of the things you can't anticipate when you make a big jump is that identity crisis of like, who am I, when your identity is so tied up to what you were doing, especially in the workplace. So thank you for sharing that. I think it's important. So let's talk about EWOB.
Okay.
Say what it is, because EWOB like sounds like a Star
So
Wars film.
EWOB is the very weird acronym for Extraordinary Women on Boards.
Mm-hmm.
And as you could tell by that acronym, that sometimes sounds like Ewok, or if you're a Star Wars fan or whatever it is, like that wasn't really meant for prime time. And this wasn't a business plan generated idea. This came from just listening and having a lot of coffees, and then realizing that that there were some unmet needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell us what is it? What does it look like? Yeah, just sort of tell us about the business. I in my brain, I kind of describe it as an association, but just tell us what it is and what you do.
Sure. So today, Extraordinary Women on Boards is a community of women who are highly accomplished and who are serving on public or private for-profit boards. So it is a community for experienced directors who are actively serving, or who in the past have served on public or private for-profit boards. And we learn together. It's a fantastic peer group that, for many, when they make that shift into this life stage I described, maybe find that they don't have the peers that they used to have when they were working. So it's a peer group of women already in the boardroom trying to make the most of their seats at the table. Because what gets you in the boardroom doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be an excellent director. And there just aren't so many trusted, safe spaces where you can be a highly accomplished, smart, successful person, but maybe have to ask some basic questions, or in your desire to be excellent and have an impact in the boardroom, have a way to learn about certain situations that you might be experiencing for the first time from this incredible peer group. And so it's very much a learning community, a peer-to-peer network, and an organically grown by referral group, so that it's supportive, it's generous, and it's just a tremendous resource.
How did you get the idea for it?
So I was, as I told you, wandering around the streets of New York, meeting with founders. And every so often I would, be introduced by my network to a woman who had just started serving on boards. When I left Goldman, while I was at Goldman, I wasn't able to serve on boards. When I left Goldman, I kind of accidentally, thanks to my relationships, ended up on a public board and a VC-backed private board relatively quickly. Although if you had bumped into me, I wouldn't have described my identity at that point as a board director. It just happened to be something that I started to do. And I started to meet some women, frankly, 15 women in a row, who had just left highly accomplished careers, were the only woman in their first or second boardroom, and were wishing for this trusted, safe space. We're wishing for a peer group. We're going through an identity crisis. We're fearful of becoming irrelevant, wanted to stay cutting edge, and wanted to be the best board directors that they could be. And they were looking for different organizations or forums where they could feel safe, and respected, asking whatever question they want, and weren't finding that. Either in some instances, there might be a co-ed forum where there might be some older men who were already questioning, why is this woman taking, my colleague's board seat? She's asking a very basic question. Maybe she doesn't belong in the boardroom. Maybe she's a token. Nobody wants to be associated with that. That's not a safe space to ask questions. Or, the many great organizations that were focused on women and boards, but would combine women, aspiring to be on boards with women already on boards. And while that was important, and while, we all want more women on boards, that conversation would be, how do I get on a board?
Right.
It wouldn't be the very nerdy conversation. I just became chair of the audit committee. What do I need to know? An activist just showed up at my board. Has anyone had this situation? And what are things that would be smart questions or things to ask? Or I'm joining my first private company board, and there's no published information as to how compensation works. Can someone give me some benchmarks or some advice? Or, we're going through a CEO succession, and I just had these really interesting insights. I'd love to share them with anyone else who is on a NomGov committee. Could we get together and discuss that? Or, as you might imagine, during the pandemic, when the remit for board directors exploded, right? We have to know things that we've never encountered before. How are you dealing with, your hybrid work policy? Or what are you finding are, ways that you're dealing with COVID restrictions? We now are 950 members and grow by referral. We represent over 2,500 boards. And so the likelihood that you're going to be able to identify emerging best practices from sharing in the collective wisdom of this group is high. So people were asking for that trusted, safe space, that, kind of peer group that was powerful, but at the same time, no ego, armor off. Often women walk around with armor on, armor off. Let's just all help each other. And that, same conversation I had 15 times resulted in my thinking, well, I should get all these women together. They all want to meet other women on boards. I seem to be the common link. And that was supposed to be a one-off lunch. It was an amazing lunch. That one-off lunch suddenly became a side hustle for me. And I kept getting the group together every 5 or 6 weeks in the tri-state area. They would all show up and they would start to ask, can I bring this other amazing woman who's already on at least one public or private for-profit board, because I think she'll enjoy it. And I'm like, sure. A law firm would pay for lunch. There were no real expenses other than my time. And it grew and grew up until the pandemic, to 100 people. And then once we switched to Zoom, this group wanted to meet more often. There were no longer the geographical or physical constraints, because anyone could join a Zoom and everyone needed to. And so it really exploded then. And I looked up one day as I'm leading these EWOB sessions and recording things, writing things down on Post-it notes, just trying to, for myself and everyone, make sure that we were keeping up with all of this stuff coming at us. And I realized oh my gosh, I think I've become a startup founder. And thankfully, reconnected with an amazing woman named Lisa DiCarlo, who agreed to join me and really make this a thing and turn it into what EWOB is today.
So good. All right. So what do you think is the advantage of a feminine, and I'm going to use the word feminine or feminist perspective in a boardroom? There's lots of answers you could give, but what would you give?
Let me think about that. So I believe, having experienced, EWOB now for a few years, I believe that something magical happens when you bring women together in communities, especially ones that are trusted, safe spaces, because women don't always find themselves in those. And especially in, financial services, et cetera, you're either the only, or you're one of few, or you're fighting for your seat at the table, or whatever it might be. And as we've seen in EWOB, and this relates to the boardroom, there's such bonding and support and generosity. And overgeneralizing greatly, I would say, look, women tend to like collaborating. They like being in the details. They like making sure things are done well. They want to see things progress and improve, and they do so very inclusively. And so, boardroom dynamics do not always lend themselves to that. Often you join a board, whether you're the first woman or diverse member of that board, and that board already has its culture and already has its way of doing things, and either is welcoming or not. But what they say is if you have not one, not two, but the difference is when you have three women on a board, then it stops being about having women in the room, and the whole conversation changes. And when I've spoken to women board chairs, and let me just say, there are many excellent male board directors and many excellent male board chairs and lead directors, but just focusing on the way I see women really, really push themselves, it is some thought about how do I make this boardroom a dynamic, inclusive team. And unless you're intentional about that, it's not going to happen. And I think the best boards, get that really, really right. Whomever the chair is, it's really the chair's job to notice, is that culture good and is it there? And is it not? How can I make it comfortable for everyone to bring their voice? Because otherwise, why are they there?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I think women are really good at that. And then the whole collective wisdom, wanting to share information and help each other also is magical.
Yeah. All right. So if you could disrupt boards or how they're run, what are one or two things you would do?
Well, I mean, I'll give you my one person's opinion. But certainly what I hear reinforced from talking with all of these extraordinary women all the time about their board work, it's in part what I started to say. What does it mean to be a good board? And by that I mean, is the board thinking of itself as a team? Because bad board dynamics kill effectiveness and are a form of torture. So as much as you're focused on the culture of the company or the culture of the leadership team, what's the culture of the board? And I think often, the agenda is so packed. This world is moving so fast. It's hard to get to everything that you need to. The board doesn't necessarily take the time to say, hey, wait, let's talk about each of us as individuals and what our superpowers are that could be relevant to the board. Often I think we miss the opportunity to know what everyone's superpowers are because we only sort of marked that to market once when they joined and we were trying to fill a spec. Like often boards don't use nearly the things I could do. And granted, a public company board only wants me to keep my nose in and fingers out. They don't want me to think I'm running the company. It's oversight. But even with oversight, like there are things that I'm good at that could be helpful to the company from that perspective. Like maybe I can mentor some of their senior women, or maybe I can make certain introductions or whatever that might be. A private company board really wants to know what everyone's superpowers are and use them. And so they get the superpower part right, but they don't necessarily get the board culture part right because in the room are so many different agendas. Typically, you have investors in the room, each of whom might have a different set of key performance indicators that they're looking to meet with their investment. That's different from feeling like a team. So how do you make the board go from a bunch of individuals to making the most of all that those individuals bring and getting them to work together well? And then asking questions like, how do we as a board ask questions? How about the board materials? Everyone will complain that they get a huge packet of board materials. Like it's almost impossible to read it, but it is not often designed to lead to conversation about the most important things where the board has to be valuable or can be valuable. And so there's a lot of improvement in that arena as well that I think could make boards so much more effective. And then I would say, how do we as board directors stay cutting edge as a team? And I think that's something in EWOB, we're all positively paranoid about. But like, are you really sitting in the boardroom and not know what ChatGPT is? Like, that's a disservice. So how do we avoid that happening? And I think, how does the board keep up with all of the things? How are we asking ourselves as a board, what could disrupt us? Because If we're not, then we're gonna be surprised. Those kinds
So
of
good.
things.
Oh, so good. All right. A few final questions. So for someone who, like me, who just joined her first for-profit or private company board, what
Mm-hmm.
piece of advice would you give to say, do this one, make sure you do this one thing in order to be effective?
I think any board is lucky to get you.
Oh,
I
thank you.
think I think you find some board buddies.
Okay.
So, one of the things that I've certainly seen women do to themselves, but I've seen new board directors, whatever gender or whatever they represent, can do to themselves is, you know, filter themselves, hold themselves back, and not make use of their seat. In fact, sometimes new board directors are told to just sit there and observe
Mm,
and not say things, whatever they think, as opposed to taking advantage of the beginner's mind experience of a new board director. But I think, therefore, finding trusted, safe ways to be able to ask questions, have a sounding board for those like, am I crazy moments? Like,
yeah.
did that really just happen? Or, this person said this and squelched the whole conversation. When you need context, that board buddy can be in the room, which is great. Boards that do that, I think end up really helping a new board director climb up the curve more easily and
Mhm.
feel more comfortable, even if the conversations happen outside of the boardroom. And then talking to other board directors, a few who you can go to
Yeah.
when you might have a situation. I think that's the most valuable thing, in addition to just staying current and trying
Yeah.
to ask smart questions, which are things that good board directors did
Yeah.
in order to get to the boardroom anyway.
If you're giving advice to a person entering the workforce, a woman, someone in an underrepresented group, but not to that person, but to people who are managing those individuals, what advice would you give based on your own experience of people, welcoming you as being, the foreigner in Japan, or whatever life experience you have?
I think this is a weird workforce to enter right now. And so for someone entering it, there are so many more variables, which really boil down to, how do I build strong relationships?
Mm,
And how do I get people to be in my corner,
mm,
and believe in me and push me, and allow me to show my potential. And in person, that was a lot easier to do for folks.
mm.
And now you need to be really thoughtful, whether you're the manager or whether you're the new employee. How am I going to build that relationship? And so I think it's both, as the new person, being very strategic and intentional, and somehow removing those voices of doubt about taking up someone's time or whether you'll have something relevant to say, to just find out, hey, how can we get to know each other better? And maybe that will mean, if you're in a remote work experience, going in and meeting someone in person. Maybe in a hybrid, you want to be in the office more, because you're going to have those like old water cooler moments where like wisdom will be dropped, and
Mhm.
you want to catch it. But I think, for someone joining anything now, having a great attitude, being curious, being willing to roll up your sleeves, learn, and do anything, is a huge differentiator. We've heard quiet quitting. We've heard all kinds of things that happen, and all kinds of miscommunications or misunderstandings or assumptions that Zoom conversations sometimes bring, that get in the way. Bring the sunshine, right? Bring an attitude that's great. And then that alone will encourage people to get to know you.
Yeah.
And for the manager, how are you going to get to know this person? How are you going to create the trusted, safe space? How are you going to give them feedback and make them feel it's okay to make a mistake? It's okay to come to me to talk. That's a lot of intentionality too.
Yeah.
But I was very lucky to, work with great managers who were mentors and managers who could, give me tough love when I needed it. And I knew it was love with toughness, and believe in me and push me to do things I didn't think I could do. So I kind of think those are the ingredients.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
Over and over again. I mean, you had people who were pushing you over and over again, which is a gift. And it also is a testament to the belief that you weren't fragile, that you could do it. You could step into that moment. Okay. So penultimate question, what's been useful for you in this conversation?
Well, I think you've made me reflect on just how dots connect. And I think it seems perfectly normal and natural to you, given what you do, what you study, what you write about, and all these amazing conversations that you have in this podcast that I love, that that careers can go in all kinds of directions. And I don't think anything that I've said has really thrown you. You're like, okay. And then you got a chance to learn this. And so I've loved the S-curve nature of it. And I guess I am a seeker of that. So I feel like you get me, and I appreciate that.
A seeker of the S. Very fun.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to put a bow on, tie this conversation up with a bow. Any final thoughts that you would like to share?
I think I would like to give a shout out to two things. One, I really do believe in the magic of communities of women. So I feel so inspired and like it's a gift. Even though it's hard work, it's a gift to get to meet incredible women all the time, hear their stories, and just see them continue to find ways in chapter after chapter to have impact. There's a lot of energy I get from that. And I encourage people to find those peer groups and find those communities. And I think the other thing I want to give a shout out to is, I've never fit inside of a box. And sometimes it's a challenge because you encounter people who want you to fit inside of a box. They're listening to all the weird things that you've done and sort of don't know what to do with you. And I feel like, in having this conversation, when you expect the out of the boxness and embrace it and encourage it. And I think that's wonderful for all those folks who sometimes feel not well understood. So thank you.
So good. Lisa, this has been a delight and a pleasure and to really get to know you better. So thank you very much.
I have to tell you that this whole time that we've been talking together, this has been such a fangirl experience for me because it's an honor to be on a podcast that I listen to all the time. Aww. And I'm just so grateful that you even thought to ask me. So thank you so much. And thank you for all you do.